When people picture Canada, they tend to imagine endless forests, frozen lakes, towering mountains, and vast stretches of untouched wilderness. Volcanoes are almost never part of that picture. Yet hidden across the western reaches of the country, especially in British Columbia and the Yukon, lies a landscape shaped by fire. A scattering of volcanoes that most Canadians have never heard of and that the wider world rarely thinks about. These are Canada's sleeping volcanoes, mountains that have not erupted in living memory, but that are not, as it turns out, entirely dead. In recent years, scientists have turned their attention back to these overlooked peaks, studying them with fresh eyes and modern tools. And what they have been learning is quietly reshaping the way we think about volcanic risk in a country that has long assumed it had none. This is the story of those sleeping giants, of why they were forgotten, and of what researchers are discovering as they study them again. But before we go further, a clear and honest word, because it matters. None of what follows means that Canada is on the verge of a volcanic disaster. These volcanoes are not erupting, and there is no sign that any of them is about to. What scientists have found is not a warning of imminent catastrophe, but something more subtle and more interesting, evidence that these mountains are still alive in the geologic sense, that they deserve to be watched, and that a country which thought it had no volcanic story to tell has one after all. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going: hitting subscribe. If you are finding this interesting, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your province or country in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. The Volcanoes Canada forgot to understand why this story matters. You first have to understand why Canada's volcanoes were so thoroughly forgotten in the first place. Unlike the United States, with its famous peaks like Mount St. Helens in Rainier, or Iceland, or Italy, Canada has no volcano that has erupted in a way that seared itself into public memory. The last significant volcanic eruptions in Canada happened long ago, in some cases thousands of years in the past, well before any written record, surviving only in the oral histories of Indigenous peoples and in the layers of rock and ash that geologists can read. Because no living Canadian has watched one of these mountains erupt, the idea that Canada even has volcanoes strikes many people as surprising, even far-fetched. This absence of recent eruptions led to a long period of relative neglect. Canada's volcanoes were studied far less intensively than those of more visibly active regions, and the country never developed the kind of dedicated volcano monitoring that nations with more obvious hazards put in place. The mountains sat quietly in remote corners of the West, known to specialists, but largely ignored by the public, and underfunded by comparison to other scientific priorities. For decades, the prevailing assumption was that these were essentially dead features of the landscape, relics of a fiery past with little bearing on the present. It is precisely this assumption that recent scientific work has begun to challenge, and the challenge has prompted a renewed effort to understand what these volcanoes really are and what they might still be capable of. The belts of fire in the West Canada's volcanoes are not scattered randomly, but are concentrated in several belts across the western part of the country, each tied to the deep geologic processes that create volcanoes in the first place. In British Columbia and the Yukon, these belts run through some of the most rugged and remote terrain in North America. Mountains and volcanic fields shaped by the movement of the great plates of the earth and by hot material rising from below. Some of these volcanoes are classic cone shapes, others are broad fields of past eruptions, and still others are jagged peaks worn by ice and time. But all of them are expressions of the same underlying reality. The west of Canada sits in a geologically active part of the continent, connected to the same forces that fuel the volcanoes of the American Pacific Northwest and Alaska. Among these belts, certain volcanoes stand out as the most significant, the ones that have erupted most recently in geologic terms, or that show the clearest signs of remaining life. These are the mountains that have drawn the renewed attention of scientists, because they represent the places where Canada's volcanic story is most active and most relevant. The volcanoes of these western belts are not uniform in their behavior or their risk, and part of the work of recent research has been to sort out which of them are truly dormant, capable of future activity, and which are effectively extinct. This sorting matters because it is the foundation of any effort to understand and prepare for volcanic hazards. And it is a task that had been left undone for far too long in a country that assumed it did not need to bother. The variety among these volcanoes is itself remarkable. Some are found near the mountains and valleys of the southern coast, within reach of towns and popular recreation areas, while others stand in the far northern wilderness, rarely visited and little known. Some have produced dramatic eruptions in the geologic past, including events that interacted with the ice of glaciers and reshaped the surrounding terrain in unusual ways, while others have built themselves up quietly over long stretches of time. This diversity means that Canada's volcanic story is not a single narrative, but many, each mountain with its own history and its own character. And untangling those stories has been part of the work that has drawn scientists back to these long-neglected peaks. The more closely researchers look, the more they find that the western volcanic landscape of Canada is richer and more complex than the old assumption of a few dead mountains ever suggested. Mount Meager. The one that erupted last, if there is a single volcano at the heart of Canada's renewed volcanic attention, it is Mount Meager, a rugged peak in the mountains of southwestern British Columbia, not terribly far from populated areas and popular recreation regions. Mount Meager holds a special place in the country's volcanic story because it is the site of the most recent major volcanic eruption known in Canada, an event that occurred a few thousand years ago and that was, by all evidence, a powerful one, sending ash across a wide area and leaving deposits that geologists have studied to reconstruct what happened. That eruption marks Mount Meager as the most recently active of Canada's great volcanoes, and by itself that fact makes it the natural focus of concern and study. But Mount Meager is significant for more than its ancient eruption, because the mountain has shown, in more recent times, that it remains a restless and unstable place. It is known for producing enormous landslides as the volcanically weakened rock of the mountain gives way, and one such massive landslide in recent years was among the largest in Canadian history, sending a torrent of rock and debris down the mountain's flanks. This instability is itself a hazard, quite apart from any eruption, and it is tied to the volcanic nature of the mountain, whose rock has been weakened and altered by the heat and fluids of its volcanic system. Mount Meager, in other words, is a mountain that continues to demonstrate its restlessness, and it is this ongoing activity, combined with its recent eruptive history, that has made it a centerpiece of the renewed scientific effort to understand Canada's volcanoes. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Before today, did you have any idea that Canada had active volcanoes at all? Be honest. Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your answers help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to the mountains. What scientists have been finding. Here is where the story becomes especially compelling, because when scientists returned to study Mount Meager and its fellow volcanoes with modern instruments and renewed determination, they found evidence that these mountains are not the dead relics they had long been assumed to be. At Mount Meager, researchers have documented signs of ongoing volcanic heat and activity beneath the surface, including openings on the mountain where hot gases escape from the volcanic system below, a phenomenon known as fumaroles. The presence of these hot gas emissions is a clear indication that the volcanic system is still warm, still connected to a source of heat at depth, and still, in the geologic sense, alive. A truly dead volcano does not vent hot gas. A sleeping one may. And that is what the evidence at Mount Meager suggests. Beyond the direct signs of heat, scientists studying these volcanoes have used a range of modern techniques to probe what lies beneath them, mapping the structure of the mountains, measuring the gases they release, examining the deposits of past eruptions to understand their history and behavior, and looking for the subtle signs of activity that might otherwise go unnoticed. This work has helped to build a far richer picture of Canada's volcanoes than existed before, revealing them as complex, living systems with real histories and real potential, rather than as inert features of the landscape. The findings do not indicate that an eruption is coming, but they do establish, more firmly than before, that these are genuine volcanoes capable of future activity, and that they warrant the kind of ongoing attention that they had long been denied. The renewed study has, in effect, woken the scientific community up to a reality that had been quietly ignored. Part of what makes this work possible now is the advance of technology. Because tools that did not exist or were not widely available in earlier decades have transformed what scientists can learn about a volcano without ever setting foot on its most dangerous slopes. Satellite observations can detect subtle changes in the shape of the ground and the heat radiating from a mountain. Sensitive instruments can measure the faintest tremors deep below. And careful analysis of the gases venting from a volcano can reveal what is happening in the system that feeds it. Applied to Canada's long, overlooked volcanoes, these tools have begun to fill in a picture that was almost blank, turning vague assumptions into real data and allowing researchers to say with growing confidence which of these mountains are truly sleeping rather than dead. It is a striking example of how renewed attention, combined with modern science, can reveal that a landscape long taken for granted has been hiding secrets in plain sight. The warning written in an earthquake swarm, one of the most striking pieces of evidence for the living nature of Canada's volcanoes, came not from Mount Meager, but from another site, where a burst of small earthquakes offered a glimpse of the forces still at work beneath the surface. At a volcanic area in the interior of British Columbia, scientists recorded a swarm of small earthquakes at depth, a pattern of seismic activity that experts interpreted as consistent with the movement of molten rock deep below the ground. The earthquakes were small and posed no direct danger, and no eruption followed. But the episode was significant because it suggested that magma was still moving in the depths beneath a Canadian volcanic field, a sign of life from a system that many would have assumed was long dormant. This episode was a wake-up call in its own right, because it demonstrated in real time that Canada's volcanic systems are not static, that the deep processes which feed volcanoes are still operating beneath the country's western landscapes, and that activity can occur with little warning in places that had received almost no monitoring. The fact that such a swarm could happen and be detected only because instruments happened to be positioned to catch it underscored how little was truly known about these systems and how easily their stirrings could go unnoticed. It was a reminder that the quiet of Canada's volcanoes is not the same as death, and that beneath the still surface, the machinery of the earth continues to turn. It also highlighted just how much can be missed when monitoring is sparse, since a similar swarm in an unmonitored area might have passed entirely unrecorded, leaving no trace in the scientific record and no hint to anyone that the deep rock had stirred at all. Episodes like this have helped drive the renewed interest in studying and monitoring these volcanoes, because they reveal that the potential for activity, however remote in any given year, is genuinely there. Quick pause, because this is worth sharing. If you are finding this fascinating, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more curious people. And if you have family or friends in British Columbia, the Yukon, or the Pacific Northwest, share this with them, because it is genuinely interesting and useful to know what is out there. One like, one share to someone you care about. And let's keep going. The monitoring gap scientists want to close. One of the most important themes to emerge from the renewed study of Canada's volcanoes is not about any single mountain, but about a gap, a shortfall in the systems needed to keep watch over these sleeping giants. Compared to countries with more obviously active volcanoes, Canada has historically had very little dedicated volcano monitoring, few instruments positioned to detect the early signs of awakening, and limited resources devoted to tracking the behavior of these remote peaks. For a long time, this seemed reasonable, because the volcanoes were assumed to be dormant and the risk was thought to be negligible. But the growing evidence that these mountains are still alive has changed the calculation, and scientists have increasingly argued that Canada needs to strengthen its ability to watch over its volcanoes. The concern is straightforward. A volcano that is not monitored can begin to stir without anyone noticing until the signs become obvious, potentially reducing the warning time that communities would have to prepare and respond. While the volcanoes of Canada are mostly in remote areas, some of them are not so far from populated places, transportation routes, and infrastructure. And a significant eruption or a major volcanic landslide could have real consequences for people and for the systems they depend on. Closing the monitoring gap by placing more instruments on and around the key volcanoes and by studying them more continuously would give scientists a far better chance of detecting any awakening early and of understanding the behavior of these systems before they become a threat. This push to improve monitoring is one of the most concrete outcomes of the renewed scientific attention. A recognition that understanding these volcanoes is not enough if we are not also watching them. Why this matters even without an eruption it would be easy to dismiss all of this as academic, a matter of interest only to geologists, given that no eruption is expected and the volcanoes have slept for thousands of years. But the renewed study of Canada's volcanoes matters for reasons that go beyond the immediate question of whether one will erupt soon. For one thing, the volcanic instability of mountains like Mount Meager creates hazards even without an eruption, most notably the enormous landslides that such weakened, altered peaks can produce, which are a genuine danger to anything downstream and which can occur with little warning. Understanding the volcanic nature of these mountains is essential to understanding and preparing for these landslide hazards, which are a present reality rather than a distant possibility. Beyond the hazards, the study of these volcanoes also carries real benefits and opportunities. The same volcanic heat that makes these mountains potentially dangerous also represents a potential source of clean geothermal energy, and understanding the volcanic systems is a first step toward tapping that resource. The research deepens our scientific understanding of how volcanoes work and how the western part of the continent is evolving geologically, knowledge that has value in its own right and that connects Canada's volcanoes to the broader story of the restless Earth. And it corrects a long-standing blind spot, ensuring that a real feature of the country's landscape is properly understood rather than ignored. In all these ways, the renewed attention to Canada's sleeping volcanoes is worthwhile, regardless of whether any of them ever erupts, because it replaces ignorance with knowledge and neglect with vigilance. All right, I know, second time I am bringing this up, you can roll your eyes at me, but quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about Canadian volcanoes, of all things, you are exactly the kind of curious person this channel is made for, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time. Promise. Let's finish. The bigger picture of a restless continent, when we set Canada's sleeping volcanoes within the larger context, they become part of a story that stretches all the way down the western edge of North America, from Alaska through British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest to California. A great belt of volcanic and geologic activity tied to the movement of the plates and the rising of heat from within the Earth. Canada's volcanoes are the northern extension of this system, connected to the same deep forces that fuel the more famous volcanoes to the south, and understanding them helps complete the picture of a continent that is far more geologically alive than most people realize. The mountains of Western Canada are not isolated curiosities, but part of a vast and interconnected volcanic landscape, and the renewed study of them adds an important chapter to our understanding of the whole. This bigger picture also reframes how we should think about the quiet of these volcanoes. Their long slumber is not a sign that they are finished, but simply the normal state of volcanoes that operate on timescales far longer than human memory, erupting only rarely across spans of thousands of years. The scientists studying them are not sounding an alarm, but doing the patient, essential work of understanding a natural system that had been overlooked, so that the country can hold an accurate picture of its own landscape and be prepared, however unlikely the need, for whatever the future brings. The story of Canada's sleeping volcanoes is ultimately a story about the value of curiosity and vigilance, about the way careful science can reveal that a familiar landscape holds more than we assumed, and about the deep, slow, magnificent forces that continue to shape even the quietest corners of the world. What the renewed study really tells us. In the end, what scientists have found in returning to Canada's sleeping volcanoes is not a countdown to disaster, but a correction of a long-held misunderstanding, a recognition that these mountains are living features of the Earth deserving of study and watchfulness. They have found hot gases still venting from Mount Meager, evidence of magma moving beneath the western landscape, records of eruptions more recent than many had ever assumed, and hazards like massive landslides that remain real even in the complete absence of any eruption. They have found, above all, that a country which had long believed it had no volcanoes at all to worry about actually holds a genuine, if quiet, volcanic landscape, one that had been neglected for too long and that now, at last, is beginning to receive the careful, sustained attention it has always deserved. This is not a reason for fear, but a reason for appreciation and for prudent care, an invitation to see Canada's wild and beautiful western mountains not merely as scenery, but as living, breathing expressions of the planet's deep inner fire. The sleeping volcanoes of Canada are truly stirring only in the sense that our own understanding of them is finally awakening, and in that awakening lies not danger, but knowledge. The kind of knowledge that helps a country understand its own ground, prepare wisely for the future, and respect the extraordinary and ancient forces that lie,